The dust devil twisted across the parched earth of the Whitaker ranch, carrying with it the last shreds of hope that rain might come before everything turned to bone and ash. Sarah Whitaker stood on the warped wooden porch of her ranch house, watching the cattle cluster around the nearly dry creek bed that cut through her property, their ribs showing for nearly 18 months. Choking the life out of everything her father had built before the fever took him 6 months ago. At 23 years old, she had inherited a dying dream and the crushing weight of keeping it alive. The sun beat down mercilessly as Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her forehead. Her dark hair, once carefully pinned, now hung in limp strands around her face. The well was down to a trickle, barely enough to keep the house supplied with drinking water, and the creek that her cattle depended on was nothing more than a series of stagnant pools connected by cracked mud. She had already sold half her herd at prices that made her want to weep, and the remaining 40 head would not survive another month without water. Behind her, the screen door creaked open, and her younger brother Thomas emerged, his face gaunt and worried. At 19, he had grown into a man too quickly after their father's death, but he lacked the experience and the physical strength to manage a ranch of this size. The responsibility had fallen almost entirely on Sarah's shoulders, and the weight of it was crushing her spirit day by day. "The Henderson place just sold," Thomas said quietly, leaning against the porch railing. "Bank foreclosed on them yesterday. They are packing up and heading back east." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the words like a physical blow. The Hendersons had been their neighbors for 12 years, good people who had fought as hard as anyone to keep their land. If they had given up, what chance did she have? The bank had already sent 2 letters warning her that if she could not make the payment due in 3 months, they would have no choice but to foreclose on the Whitaker ranch as well. "We will not give up," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Papa built this place from nothing. He survived the war, survived cattle drives, survived everything the land could throw at him. We owe it to him to keep fighting." Thomas looked at her with a mixture of admiration and despair. "Sarah, fighting is not going to bring rain. We have done everything we can. Maybe we should consider selling before the bank takes it all anyway." "No," Sarah said firmly, turning to face her brother. "This is our home. This is our legacy. There has to be a way." But even as she spoke the words, she felt the hollowness of them. She had prayed for rain until her knees were bruised from kneeling on the hard floor of her bedroom. She had watched the sky every day for clouds that never came. She had rationed water and moved cattle and worked until her hands bled and her body ached, and none of it had made any difference. The land was dying, and she was dying with it. That afternoon, Sarah saddled her mare, Dancer, and rode out to check on the herd. The horse moved listlessly through the heat, and Sarah could feel the animal's ribs through the saddle. Everything was wasting away, slowly starving and thirsting to death. She followed the dried creek bed north, toward the property line that separated her land from the Bar M Ranch, owned by a man named Marcus Cole, who had arrived in the territory 3 years ago with enough money to buy up several failing properties and consolidate them into one of the largest spreads in the county. As she rode, Sarah noticed something that made her pull Dancer to a halt. There, just on the other side of the fence, she saw a small, dark figure. It was a fox, and it was running towards her. She dismounted and walked forward, her heart beginning to pound. There, just on the other side of the fence that marked where Cole's land began, the creek held actual running water. Not much, but a clear, steady flow that looked like salvation itself. Sarah stood there for a long moment, trying to understand what she was seeing. The creek originated in the hills to the north, on Cole's property, and had always flowed south through both ranches. But now the water was not reaching her land at all. She walked along the fence line, following the creek upstream onto Cole's property, her mind racing. After about half a mile, she found what she was looking for and what she had feared she would find. Someone had built a dam across the creek, a crude but effective structure of rocks and timber that diverted the water into a new channel, sending it east across Cole's property instead of south onto hers. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Cole had not just been surviving the drought better than his neighbors, he had been stealing their water. Rage flooded through Sarah, hot and fierce, burning away the despair that had been weighing her down. She remounted Dancer and rode hard for the Bar M Ranch house, a sprawling adobe structure that sat in a valley 5 miles from the property line. By the time she arrived, her anger had only intensified. She dismounted and strode up to the front door, pounding on it with her fist. A middle-aged Mexican woman opened the door, her eyes widening at the sight of Sarah's furious face. "I need to see Marcus Cole," Sarah demanded. "Right now." "Mr. Cole is not here," the woman said nervously. "He is out with the men, checking the east pasture." "Then tell me where to find him," Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice level. The woman gave her directions and Sarah rode out again, her fury giving her energy despite the heat. She found Cole about an hour later, sitting on a big bay stallion and surveying a herd of cattle that looked healthy and well-fed, a stark contrast to her own dying animals. There were 3 other cowboys with him, all of them turning to watch as she approached. Marcus Cole was a big man, probably in his late 30s, with broad shoulders and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore expensive boots and a black hat that looked new, the clothes of a man who had money to spare. His dark eyes narrowed as Sarah rode up to him, and he held up a hand to stop his men from moving forward. "Miss Whitaker," he said, his voice deep and smooth, "this is a surprise. What brings you onto my land?" "You know exactly what brings me here," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "You dammed up the creek. You are stealing water that has always flowed through my property." Cole's expression did not change. "I have done no such thing. The creek originates on my land, which means the water is mine to do with as I please." "That is not how water rights work, and you know it," Sarah shot back. "That creek has flowed through my property for over 20 years. My father built his ranch depending on that water. You have no right to divert it." "I have every right," Cole said calmly. "I built a dam on my own property to manage my water resources. If that happens to affect the flow onto your land, well, that is just the nature of living in drought country. Maybe if your father had been smart enough to secure his water rights legally, you would not be in this position." Sarah felt tears of rage and frustration burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You are killing my ranch. You are killing my cattle. You know that, and you are doing it on purpose." Cole shrugged, his face showing no emotion. "I am doing what I need to do to protect my own interests. That is how business works, Miss Whitaker. If you cannot manage your property effectively, perhaps you should consider selling it to someone who can. I would be willing to make you a fair offer." The pieces suddenly fell into place in Sarah's mind. This had been Cole's plan all along. He had waited for the drought to weaken his neighbors, then cut off their water entirely, forcing them to sell at rock-bottom prices. The Hendersons had probably suffered the same fate. "I will never sell to you," Sarah said, her voice cold. "And I will fight this. The law is on my side." "The law takes time, Miss Whitaker," Cole said with a thin smile, "and lawyers cost money. How long do you think your cattle can survive while you are fighting a legal battle? How many months can you go without making your bank payments?" He leaned forward in his saddle. "I will give you $5,000 for your property. That is more than generous, considering its current condition." "Go to hell," Sarah said, and wheeled Dancer around, riding away before Cole could see the tears that were now streaming down her face. She rode hard for home, her mind spinning with desperation and fury. Cole was right about one thing. The law would take months, maybe years, and she did not have that kind of time. She needed water now, or everything was lost. By the time she reached her ranch house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that made the land look like it was on fire. Thomas was waiting for her on the porch, and one look at her face told him that something was seriously wrong. She told him everything, her words tumbling out in a rush. When she finished, Thomas sat down heavily on the porch steps, his face pale. "What are we going to do?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," Sarah admitted, the fight draining out of her. "I honestly do not know." That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house creaked around her in the night wind, and she could hear the restless lowing of the cattle in the distance, their thirst making them agitated. She thought about her father, about the years he had spent building this ranch, the pride he had taken in every fence post and every calf born on his land. She thought about her mother, who had died when Sarah was 10, worn down by the hard life but never complaining, always supporting her husband's dreams. This ranch was more than just land and cattle. It was her family's blood and sweat and tears poured into the Texas soil, and she would be damned if she would let Marcus Cole steal it from her without a fight. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah threw herself into finding a solution. She rode into town to talk to a lawyer who confirmed what Cole had said about water rights being complicated and expensive to litigate. She talked to her neighbors, discovering that 3 other ranches had been similarly affected by Cole's water diversions over the past year, and all of them had eventually sold out to him. She looked into drilling a new well, but the cost was far beyond what she could afford, and there was no guarantee they would find water anyway. With each passing day, her cattle grew weaker. 2 of them died, and she had to sell 5 more at prices so low they barely covered the cost of transporting them to market. The bank sent another letter, this one more threatening than the last. Thomas grew increasingly withdrawn, and Sarah could see that he was losing hope. It was on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after her confrontation with Cole, that everything changed. Sarah was in the barn, trying to repair a broken bridle, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She walked out into the sunlight, shading her eyes, and saw a rider coming down the road toward her house. As he got closer, she could see that he was leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. The man who rode into her yard was not Marcus Cole, and he was not anyone she recognized. He was younger than Cole, probably in his late 20s, with sandy brown hair and a lean, weathered build that spoke of a life spent in hard work. He wore plain clothes, well worn but clean, and his horse was a good solid animal without any fancy tack. There was something in the way he sat his horse, easy and confident, that caught Sarah's attention. He pulled his horse to a stop near the porch and touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon, ma'am. I am looking for the owner of this property. Would that be you?" "It would," Sarah said cautiously. "Can I help you with something?" The man dismounted with an easy grace and walked toward her, extending his hand. "Name is James Brennan. I am looking for work. I heard in town that you might be hiring." Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "I am afraid you heard wrong," she said. "I cannot afford to hire anyone right now. In fact, I am barely keeping this place running as it is." James Brennan looked around the ranch, his eyes taking in the dried creek bed, the thin cattle, the general air of desperation that hung over everything. His face grew thoughtful. "Drought has been hard on you," he said quietly. It was not a question. "Hard on everyone," Sarah replied, feeling suddenly defensive. "Not that it is any of your business." "No, ma'am, I suppose it is not," Brennan said. "But I have been working ranches since I was 14 years old, and I know when a place is in trouble." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "I also know when trouble is not entirely natural." Sarah stiffened. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean, I have seen Marcus Cole's operation," Brennan said. "I mean, I noticed that his cattle are fat and healthy, while every other ranch in this area is barely surviving. I mean, I know something about water and where it goes and what happens when a man decides to keep it all for himself." Sarah stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. "You know about the dam?" "I know about dams in general," Brennan said carefully. "I have worked on irrigation systems, helped build water management structures. I know how water flows and how to redirect it." He met her eyes steadily. "I also know that what is done can be undone if a man has the right skills and the will to do it." Sarah felt hope flutter in her chest, fragile as a moth's wing. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You do not know me. You do not owe me anything." Brennan was quiet for a moment, and something passed across his face, a shadow of old pain. "Let us just say, I have personal experience with men like Marcus Cole," he said finally. "Men who use their money and power to crush anyone who stands in their way. My family had a small ranch in New Mexico Territory 5 years ago. A big operator named Garrison wanted our land because it controlled access to a river. When my father would not sell, Garrison found ways to make our life hell. Cut our fences, stampeded our cattle, bribed the local sheriff to look the other way." He paused, his jaw tightening. "My father had a heart condition. The stress of fighting Garrison killed him. My mother sold the ranch for a fraction of what it was worth and moved back east with my 2 sisters. I have been drifting ever since, working where I can, learning what I can, but I swore that if I ever got the chance to help someone stand up to a bully like that, I would take it." Sarah studied his face, seeing the sincerity in his blue-gray eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of determination and integrity. Every instinct told her that this man was telling the truth, that he genuinely wanted to help, but she also knew that if they went after Cole's dam, there would be consequences. Cole will not take kindly to anyone interfering with his water supply," she said quietly. "It could be dangerous." "Most things worth doing are," Brennan replied with a slight smile. "But I am not talking about doing anything illegal, ma'am. I am talking about water management. If there was a natural rock slide, say, that happened to redirect water back into its original channel, well, that would just be an act of God, would it not?" Despite everything, Sarah felt a smile tugging at her lips. "I suppose it would," she said. Maybe a small wage when the ranch gets back on its feet. That is all I am asking." Sarah made her decision. "All right, Mr. Brennan. You have got yourself a deal." "James," he said. "Just call me James." "Then you should call me Sarah." Thomas came out of the house then, eyeing the stranger warily. Sarah introduced them, and she could see her brother's skepticism as she explained what James had proposed. But Thomas, like Sarah, was desperate enough to grasp at any hope, and after a few minutes of conversation, he seemed to warm to the newcomer. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, the three of them sat on the porch as the sun set, and James laid out his plan. He would ride out the next morning to scout the dam properly, to understand its construction, and to figure out the best way to redirect the water. He made it clear that whatever they did had to look natural, because if Cole could prove they had deliberately destroyed his dam, there would be legal consequences that could destroy Sarah just as surely as the drought. "The key is patience," James said. "We cannot just blow up the dam and hope for the best. We need to understand the water flow, the geology of the creek bed, and the weakest points in Cole's construction. Then we can make strategic changes that look like natural erosion or rock slides." Sarah listened, impressed by his knowledge and his careful thinking. There was something solid about James Brennan, something trustworthy. In the short time he had been here, she already felt more hopeful than she had in months. Over the next few days, James rode out each morning before dawn, spending hours studying the creek and the dam. He took Sarah with him on the second day, pointing out the details of Cole's construction and explaining how water sought its own level, how pressure built up behind barriers, how the smallest crack could become a flood if the conditions were right. As they worked together, Sarah found herself drawn to James in ways that had nothing to do with his plan to save her ranch. There was a quiet strength about him, a competence that showed in everything he did. He was gentle with the horses, patient with Thomas, and treated Sarah with a respect that had nothing to do with her being a woman and everything to do with her being the owner of the ranch. He listened when she talked about her father, about her struggles, about her fears. And he shared his own stories, tales of his travels, of the places he had seen and the people he had met. Love it too much. It would be easier to love it too much. It would be easier to just walk away, to start over somewhere else. But every rock and tree and blade of grass feels like family to me. My father used to say that the land gets into your blood, and once it does, you can never truly leave. He was right, James said. I felt that way about our place in New Mexico. Even now, years later, I still dream about it sometimes. The way the mountains looked in the morning light, the smell of sage after a rain, the sound of the river running over the rocks. He paused. That is why I am helping you, Sarah, because I know what it is like to lose that, and I would not wish it on anyone. Sarah looked at him, at the strong profile of his face in the fading light, and felt something shift in her chest. It was more than gratitude, more than appreciation for his help. It was the beginning of something deeper, something that both excited and frightened her. On the 6th day after James arrived, he announced that he was ready. He had identified 3 key points where the dam was structurally weak, where the water pressure was greatest, and where a carefully placed rock slide could breach the barrier and send the water flowing back into its natural channel. But it had to be done at night, when Cole's men would not see them, and it had to be done quickly. That night, Sarah, James, and Thomas rode out together under a crescent moon. They brought tools and rope and a carefully planned sequence of actions that James had worked out. When they reached the dam, James worked with swift efficiency, using a pry bar to loosen key rocks, digging away at the soil that supported critical sections of the timber framework, redirecting the water pressure to weak points. Sarah and Thomas followed his instructions, moving rocks, clearing debris, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. For 2 hours they worked in near silence, communicating with hand signals and whispers. And then, suddenly, there was a cracking sound, and a section of the dam gave way. Water poured through the breach, widening it rapidly, carrying away rocks and timber with its force. Within minutes, the entire eastern diversion collapsed, and the creek surged back into its original channel, flowing south toward Sarah's property with a beautiful, rushing sound that was the most wonderful thing she had ever heard. "We need to go," James said urgently. "Now." They mounted their horses and rode hard for home, the sound of the water following them through the darkness. By the time they reached Sarah's ranch, they were exhausted and soaked with sweat, but Sarah felt more alive than she had in months. They had done it. They had taken back what was rightfully hers. The next morning, Sarah walked down to the creek and found it running full and strong, the water clear and cold and perfect. She knelt beside it, scooping up a handful and drinking deeply, feeling tears of relief streaming down her face. The cattle had already found the water, and they stood in the creek drinking their fill, their tails swishing contentedly. Thomas let out a whoop of joy, and even James allowed himself a broad smile. For the first time in a very long time, Sarah felt like everything might actually be all right. But their celebration was short-lived. That afternoon, Marcus Cole arrived at the ranch with 4 of his men, his face dark with fury. Sarah, James, and Thomas met them in the yard, and Sarah could feel the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. "You destroyed my dam," Cole said, his voice low and dangerous. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. "There was a rock slide last night up in the hills. I heard it myself. A natural occurrence, I'm afraid. The land does what it wants, especially during a drought when the soil is unstable." Cole's eyes narrowed. "There was nothing natural about what happened to my dam. Someone deliberately sabotaged it. I know it was you." "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Cole," James said, stepping forward. "Do you have any proof?" Cole turned his gaze to James, and Sarah saw recognition flicker across his face. "I know you. You are Jim Brennan, Sam Brennan's son. You worked for Garrison in New Mexico before everything fell apart." "I worked for Garrison until I found out what kind of man he was," James said coldly. "Then I quit, and my family paid the price for Garrison's greed, just like you have been making your neighbors pay for yours." "Careful, boy," Cole said. "Miss Whitaker and her neighbors. You have Miss Whitaker and her neighbors. You have been forcing people out of their homes and off their land through illegal means. If you want to talk about involving the law, I would be happy to have that conversation. But I do not think you would like how it turned out." For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other, and Sarah held her breath, terrified that violence was about to erupt. But then Cole seemed to make a decision. He pulled his hand away from his gun and smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "This is not over," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot. You have made an enemy today, Miss Whitaker, and I promise you will regret it." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. Sarah let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, and her legs suddenly felt weak. James put a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "He is going to come after us," Thomas said, his voice worried. "He is going to find a way to destroy us." "Let him try," Sarah said, finding her strength again. "We have the water now. We have a fighting chance. And we have each other." Over the next few weeks, the ranch slowly began to recover. The cattle grew stronger with regular access to water, and Sarah was able to buy feed to supplement what little grass had survived the drought. The well refilled, and the garden that her mother had planted years ago began to show signs of life. It was still hard work, dawn to dusk every day. But now there was hope to sustain them. James proved to be worth 10 hired hands. He could fix anything, from broken fences to sick cattle. He knew about soil conservation and water management, about breeding stock and market prices. He worked tirelessly, never complaining, always finding something useful to do. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he became part of the fabric of the ranch, as essential as the water that now flowed through the creek. Sarah found herself watching him when he did not know she was looking. She noticed the way his hands moved when he worked, strong and capable. She noticed the way he smiled at some private thought, the way he talked gently to the horses, the way he treated Thomas like a younger brother, teaching him skills and building his confidence. And she noticed the way her heart beat faster when he walked into a room, the way she found excuses to work alongside him, the way she felt more complete when he was near. She told herself it was just gratitude, just the natural result of someone saving everything she held dear. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She was falling in love with James Brennan, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. One evening, about 6 weeks after James had arrived, Sarah was working in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds and watering the newly sprouted vegetables. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and the air had finally cooled enough to be pleasant. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find James standing there, his hat in his hands. "Need some help?" he asked. "I would not turn it down," Sarah said with a smile. They worked together in companionable silence for a while, and then James said, "I have been thinking about staying on permanently if you would have me. I know the ranch is not making much money yet, but I figure if I have a stake in its success, I will work that much harder to make it thrive. I could take a small salary now, and a percentage of the profits once things turn around." Sarah looked up at him, her heart suddenly racing. "You want to stay?" "I do," James said, meeting her eyes. "I like it here. I like the work. I like your brother. I like what you are trying to build." He paused. "And I like you, Sarah. I like you very much." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "I like you too," she said softly. "More than I probably should, given that you have only been here a few weeks." James took a step closer. "Some things do not need time to be true," he said. "From the moment I rode into this ranch, something felt right, like I had finally found the place I was meant to be. The place I was meant to stay." "James," Sarah whispered, and then she could not say anything more because he was kissing her, his arms wrapping around her and pulling her close. She melted into him, feeling like every broken piece of her was suddenly being put back together. The kiss was tender and passionate and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, Sarah was breathless. "I want you to stay," she said, her hands resting on his chest, "not just as a hired hand, but as a partner, in the ranch and in everything else." "Are you sure?" James asked, his eyes searching her face. "We have only known each other a short time. People will talk." "Let them talk," Sarah said fiercely. "I have spent my whole life trying to meet other people's expectations, trying to be what they thought I should be. For once, I want to do something just because it makes me happy. And you make me happy, James. You make me feel like I can do anything." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Sarah felt like she was drowning in the best possible way. When they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. "We should probably tell Thomas," James said with a laugh. "He already knows," Thomas called from the back door of the house, grinning broadly. "And about time, too. I was starting to think you two were never going to figure it out." Sarah felt herself blushing, but she was also laughing, feeling lighter and happier than she had in years. James took her hand, and they walked back to the house together, and for the first time since her father died, Sarah felt like she had a family again. The next few months were the happiest of Sarah's life. James moved into the foreman's cabin near the barn, but he took most of his meals with Sarah and Thomas, and they worked the ranch together as a team. James taught Thomas everything he knew about horses and cattle, and Sarah watched her brother blossom under the older man's patient guidance. The two men built new fences and repaired the barn, and constructed a proper irrigation system that would help them survive any future droughts. The relationship between Sarah and James deepened with each passing day. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, sharing their dreams and fears and hopes. James told her about his childhood in New Mexico, about his father's love of the land and his mother's strength in the face of hardship. Sarah told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother's death and her father's long decline, about the loneliness she had felt carrying the weight of the ranch alone. They also shared moments of simple joy, evening walks along the creek, watching the cattle graze in the meadow, sitting on the porch as the stars came out, and the night sounds of the prairie filled the air. James would sometimes play the harmonica he carried in his pocket, and Sarah would lean against his shoulder, feeling more at peace than she had ever felt in her life. But their happiness was shadowed by the knowledge that Marcus Cole had not forgotten his grudge. Cole had filed a complaint with the county sheriff, claiming that his dam had been deliberately destroyed and demanding compensation. The sheriff, a tired man named Garrett, who had no love for Cole's bullying ways, investigated but found no proof of wrongdoing. The matter was dropped, but everyone knew it was not over. Cole tried other tactics. He approached Sarah's bank, suggesting that she was a bad credit risk and that they should foreclose on her loan. But the bank manager, who had known Sarah's father and respected his memory, refused to cooperate. Cole then tried to organize other ranchers against Sarah, claiming that she was setting a dangerous precedent by destroying water management structures. But most of the ranchers in the area had suffered under Cole's water theft themselves, and they refused to side with him. Frustrated at every turn, Cole began to make threats. He told people in town that Sarah and James would pay for what they had done, that he would make sure they regretted crossing him. The threats were vague enough that the sheriff could not act on them, but specific enough to be frightening. James took the threats seriously. He started sleeping in the foreman's cabin with his rifle close at hand, and he made sure that Sarah and Thomas kept the house locked at night. They posted a watch during the dark hours, taking turns staying awake to listen for any signs of trouble. It was on a moonless night in October, 4 months after the dam had been destroyed, that trouble finally came. Thomas was on watch, sitting on the porch with a rifle across his knees, when he heard the sound of horses approaching. He immediately woke Sarah and James, and the three of them watched as a group of riders appeared out of the darkness, at least 6 men, all carrying torches. "Fire," Sarah breathed, understanding immediately what they planned. In the dry autumn air, a single torch could burn down everything her father had built. James was already moving, grabbing buckets and yelling for them to fill them with water from the well. But before they could act, one of the riders threw a torch onto the roof of the barn. The dry wood caught immediately, flames leaping up into the night sky. "Get water on the barn!" James shouted, but Sarah knew it was already too late. The barn was going to burn no matter what they did. The best they could hope for was to keep the fire from spreading to the other buildings. The riders circled, throwing more torches, and suddenly the foreman's cabin was also ablaze. Sarah grabbed a bucket and ran for the well, pumping frantically while Thomas and James formed a line to wet down the house and the fences. The heat from the burning barn was intense, and Sarah could hear the terrified sounds of the horses trapped inside. "The horses!" she screamed, and James did not hesitate. He ran toward the burning barn, kicking open the door and disappearing into the smoke and flames. Sarah's heart stopped, and she started to run after him, but Thomas grabbed her and held her back. "He knows what he is doing," Thomas said, though his voice was shaking. "We have to protect the house." Long, agonizing seconds passed, and then James emerged from the barn, leading 3 horses, their eyes rolling with terror. He slapped their rumps, sending them running to safety, and then disappeared back into the barn. He came out again with 2 more horses, coughing and staggering, his clothes smoking. "That is all of them," he gasped, and then collapsed to his knees. Sarah ran to him, helping him move away from the burning barn. His face was blackened with soot, his hands burned, but he was alive. The riders, seeing that they had failed to burn the house, rode off into the darkness, whooping and hollering. By dawn, the barn and the foreman's cabin were nothing but smoking ruins. But the house still stood, and the horses were safe, and they were all alive. Sheriff Garrett arrived mid-morning, brought by a neighbor who had seen the smoke. He walked through the destruction, his face grim. "This was Cole," Sarah said flatly. "You know it was him." "Knowing and proving are 2 different things," Garrett said wearily. "Did you see any of the riders clearly enough to identify them?" Sarah shook her head. "It was too dark, and they had bandanas covering their faces." "Then there is nothing I can do," Garrett said. "I am sorry, Sarah. I truly am, but without proof or witnesses, I cannot arrest Cole or his men." After the sheriff left, Sarah, James, and Thomas stood looking at the ruins of the barn, exhaustion and despair weighing on them. 4 months of hard work, 4 months of progress, and Cole had destroyed it in a single night. "We can rebuild," James said quietly, his voice rough from smoke inhalation. "It will take time and money, but we can do it." "With what money?" Sarah asked bitterly. "Every spare cent we have is going to the bank payment. We cannot afford to rebuild and make the payment." "Then we will sell some cattle," James said. "We will do whatever we have to do, but we will not let Cole win." Sarah looked at him, at his burned hands and soot-stained face, at the determination in his eyes, and she felt her love for him swell until it hurt. He had nearly died saving her horses. He had given everything to help her, and he was still refusing to give up. "All right," she said, "we rebuild." The next few weeks were grueling. They sold 10 head of cattle to get enough money for lumber and supplies. James and Thomas worked from dawn until dark rebuilding the barn, and Sarah handled all the other ranch work alone. It was exhausting, but there was also something almost joyful about it. They were fighting back. They were not giving up. Word spread about the fire, and neighbors began to show up to help. Men who had lost their own ranches to Cole's machinations came with tools and willing hands. Women brought food and supplies. Even the bank manager sent a note saying that he would extend the deadline on Sarah's loan by 2 months to give her time to recover. By mid-November, the barn was rebuilt, smaller than the original but sturdy and functional. The foreman's cabin was also reconstructed, though James spent most of his nights at the main house now, sleeping on the couch in the living room to be close in case of another attack. The ranch began to function normally again, and Sarah dared to hope that the worst was behind them. It was on a cold December evening, with the first hints of winter in the air, that James asked Sarah to marry him. They were sitting on the porch watching the sun set, wrapped in blankets against the chill, when he suddenly took her hand. "It's Sarah," he said. "I know this has been a hard year. I know we have faced more challenges than any two people should have to face. But through all of it, the one thing that has kept me going is you. Your strength, your courage, your refusal to give up even when everything seems hopeless. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "It is the only thing of value I own. I want you to have it. I want you to marry me and let me spend the rest of my life helping you build this ranch into everything your father dreamed it could be." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said. "Yes, James, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah was laughing and crying at the same time, and James was grinning like he had just won the greatest prize in the world. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in town. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and still beautiful. Thomas stood as James's best man, and a neighbor woman served as Sarah's attendant. The entire community turned out for the wedding, a show of support that moved Sarah to tears. Even more surprising was the visit from Sheriff Garrett the day after the wedding. He arrived at the ranch with news that made Sarah's heart soar. Marcus Cole had been arrested for cattle rustling. Apparently, some of the cattle Cole had been selling had brands that did not match his ownership papers, and when the sheriff investigated, he found evidence that Cole had been stealing cattle from several ranches over the past 2 years and altering the brands. "He is going to prison," Garrett said with satisfaction. "At least 5 years, maybe more, depending on what else we find. His ranch is being sold to pay restitution to the people he stole from. You should get something from that sale, Sarah. Maybe enough to pay off your bank loan entirely." After Garrett left, Sarah collapsed into James's arms, overwhelmed with relief. It was finally over. Cole was gone, and they were safe. The winter of 1883 was mild, and by spring, the ranch was thriving. The restitution money from the sale of Cole's ranch paid off the bank loan entirely, with enough left over to buy 30 head of new cattle and repair all the equipment and buildings that had been neglected during the hardest months of the drought. Thomas, now 20 years old, had grown into a capable ranch hand, and he talked about starting his own small herd on a section of the property. In June, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a joy so profound she could barely speak. James was equally thrilled, and he immediately began planning how to expand the house to make room for a nursery. Thomas teased them mercilessly about their constant fussing, but Sarah could see how happy he was for them. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and fall. The ranch continued to prosper, and James proved to be as good a businessman as he was a cowboy. He negotiated better prices for their cattle, established relationships with buyers in distant markets, and implemented innovative ranching techniques that increased their productivity. By the end of 1884, the Whitaker Ranch, now officially renamed the Whitaker-Brennan Ranch, was one of the most successful operations in the county. On a cold February morning in 1885, Sarah went into labor. James paced the floor of the living room, while the midwife attended to Sarah in the bedroom. Thomas sat on the porch, too nervous to stay inside. The labor was long and difficult, and James had to resist the urge to burst into the room every time he heard Sarah cry out. Finally, just as the sun was rising, the midwife opened the bedroom door with a broad smile on her face. "You have a son, Mr. Brennan," she said, "a healthy, strong boy, and your wife is doing just fine." James rushed into the room and found Sarah propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. His son, his and Sarah's son. The baby had a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air, and when James touched one of those impossibly small hands, the baby gripped his finger with surprising strength. "He is perfect," James whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "We did it," Sarah said, looking up at him with tired but happy eyes. "We built something real, James, something that will last." They named the baby Samuel, after James's father, and he quickly became the center of their universe. Thomas doted on his nephew, and the entire ranch seemed to revolve around the baby's schedule. James proved to be a natural father, patient and loving, and Sarah had never been happier. Over the next few years, the ranch continued to grow and prosper. They bought more land, expanded the herd, and built a new, larger house to accommodate their growing family. In 1887, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Sarah's mother. 2 years later, another son arrived, whom they named Thomas Jr., after Sarah's brother. By 1890, Thomas Sr. had married a school teacher from town named Margaret, and they built their own house on the western section of the ranch property. The two families worked the ranch together, a true partnership built on trust and love. The drought of the early 1880s had become a distant memory, though Sarah and James never forgot the lessons it had taught them about water conservation and proper land management. The children grew up healthy and strong, learning to ride and rope and care for the cattle. Samuel, the eldest, showed a natural talent for working with horses, just like his father. Elizabeth was gentle and kind, with her mother's determination and her father's patience. Little Thomas was adventurous and curious, always getting into mischief, but impossible to stay angry with. James and Sarah's love deepened with each passing year. They had been forged in fire and hardship, and their bond was unbreakable. Every evening after the children were in bed, they would sit on the porch together, watching the stars come out and listening to the sound of the creek running through their land. That creek, which had once been stolen from them, and which they had fought so hard to reclaim, had become a symbol of everything they had built together. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would have been if you had not ridden up that day looking for work?" Sarah asked one evening in the spring of 1892. They were celebrating their 8th wedding anniversary, and the years had been good to them. James's hair now had a few streaks of gray at the temples, and Sarah had laugh lines around her eyes from years of smiling. "I think about it all the time," James admitted. "If I had turned left instead of right at that crossroads, if I had stopped at a different ranch, if you had turned me away instead of giving me a chance. Our entire lives hung on such small moments." "I do not think it was chance," Sarah said thoughtfully. "I think you were meant to find your way here. I think we were meant to find each other." "I think you were right," James said, pulling her close. "This ranch, this life, you and the children, it is everything I never knew I was looking for, everything I never dared to hope I would find." "You saved my ranch," Sarah said softly. "You saved my life." "No," James said, tilting her chin up so he could look into her eyes. "We saved each other. You gave me a home when I was drifting. You gave me a purpose when I had none. You gave me a family and a future. If anyone was saved, it was me." They kissed as the last light faded from the western sky, and the cattle lowed softly in the distance, and somewhere in the house one of their children laughed. It was a moment of perfect peace, perfect happiness, and Sarah knew that every hardship they had endured had been worth it to reach this place. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. There were droughts, though never as severe as that first terrible one, and they weathered them with the water management systems James had built. There were harsh winters and difficult calving seasons and market fluctuations that tested their resolve. But through it all, Sarah and James faced everything together, their love a constant source of strength. In 1895, Thomas and Margaret welcomed their first child, a girl they named Sarah in honor of Thomas's sister. The ranch now employed several full-time hands, and it had become one of the most respected operations in Texas. People came from other counties to learn about their water conservation techniques and their cattle breeding program. Samuel, now 10 years old, announced that he wanted to be a rancher like his father when he grew up. Elizabeth, at 8, was more interested in books and learning, and Sarah and James supported her dreams of perhaps becoming a teacher. Little Thomas, at 6, simply wanted to do whatever his older siblings were doing, tagging along after them with determined persistence. One summer evening in 1897, Sarah stood on the porch of their home watching the sun set over land that stretched as far as the eye could see, all of it theirs, all of it thriving. James came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured. "I was just thinking about how close we came to losing all of this," Sarah said. "How close I came to giving up before you arrived. And I was thinking about how grateful I am that you were stubborn enough to stay, that you were brave enough to fight for something that was not even yours." "It was always mine," James said. "From the moment I saw you standing in this yard, trying so hard to be strong, even though you were barely holding on, I knew this was where I belonged. You were where I belonged." Sarah turned in his arms so she could face him. "I love you, James Brennan. I have loved you from the moment you offered to help me, when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you, Sarah Brennan," James said, his eyes shining with emotion. "You are my heart, my home, my everything." They stood together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and the sounds of their children playing in the house drifted out through the open windows. The creek ran full and strong through the property, its steady murmur a constant reminder of the battle they had fought and won. The cattle grazed peacefully in the meadows, fat and healthy. The land, which had once been parched and dying, now bloomed with life. This was their legacy, built from desperation and determination, from love and sacrifice. The ranch that Sarah's father had started, that she had fought to save, that James had helped to transform, would now pass to their children and their children's children. It was more than just land and cattle. It was a testament to what two people could accomplish when they refused to give up, when they stood together against impossible odds. To the drought and how a mysterious cowboy, had appeared just in time to save it. Elizabeth was protesting that it was not mysterious, that was just their father, but Samuel insisted on making it sound like a fairy tale. James and Sarah exchanged a smile. Let the boy tell his stories. The truth was magical enough. A failing ranch, a desperate woman, a drifting cowboy with nothing but his skills and his determination, and a creek full of stolen water. Put those elements together, and you got a love story that would last a lifetime, a partnership that would build an empire, and a family that would thrive for generations. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Sarah and James lay in bed, talking softly about their plans for the future. They wanted to expand the herd again, to buy the property that bordered theirs to the north. James wanted to build a proper schoolhouse on the ranch, so Elizabeth and the other children in the area could get a good education. Sarah wanted to plant an orchard, to see apple and peach trees blooming on the land, but mostly they just wanted to keep doing what they had been doing, working together, raising their children, building something that would last. It was a simple dream, but it was theirs, and they had earned it through blood and sweat and tears. As Sarah drifted off to sleep, her head on James's chest and his arm around her, she thought about that terrible summer 15 years ago when everything had seemed lost. She thought about standing in the dust watching her cattle die, feeling hopeless and alone, and then she thought about the day James Brennan had ridden into her life and changed everything. He had diverted a stream and saved her ranch. But more than that, he had restored her hope, given her a partner to share the burden, and loved her with a fierce and gentle devotion that had never wavered. He had given her everything that mattered, a family, a future, and a love that would last forever. In the morning, they would wake to another day of hard work and simple pleasures. They would check on the cattle and mend fences and make plans for the harvest. They would laugh with their children and work alongside Thomas and Margaret. They would sit on the porch in the evening and watch the sun set over their land, and they would be grateful every single day for the life they had built together. The drought that had nearly destroyed the Whitaker ranch had instead forged something stronger, something that would endure through generations. And at the heart of it all was a love story, simple and profound, between a woman who refused to give up and a man who refused to let her face her battles alone. Years turned into decades, and the ranch continued to flourish. Samuel grew into a fine young man who did indeed become a rancher, taking over more and more of the daily operations as James and Sarah grew older. He married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring county, a spirited young woman named Catherine, and they had 4 children who filled the ranch with laughter and energy. Elizabeth surprised everyone by not becoming a teacher, but instead a veterinarian, one of the first women in Texas to pursue such a profession. She studied at a university back east and then returned to the ranch where her skills with animals became invaluable. She married later in life to a lawyer from town, and they had 2 children. Young Thomas became a horse trader and breeder, developing a reputation for producing some of the finest quarter horses in the Southwest. He built his own home on the eastern section of the ranch property, expanding the family compound. He married his childhood sweetheart, a neighbor's daughter, and they had 5 children who grew up riding horses before they could walk properly. By 1910, James and Sarah were in their 50s, their hair gray but their spirits still strong. They had slowed down some, letting the younger generation take on more of the physical work, but they were still very much involved in every decision, their wisdom and experience guiding the ranch through changing times. The world was changing around them. Automobiles were starting to appear, though they were still rare in rural Texas. The railroad had finally come through their county, making it easier to ship cattle to market. Electric lights were being installed in some of the buildings, though the main house still used oil lamps in most rooms, because Sarah liked the warm glow they provided, but some things never changed. Every evening, weather permitting, James and Sarah would sit on the porch together, watching the sun set over their land. The porch had been rebuilt and expanded over the years, but it was still their favorite place, the spot where they had shared so many conversations, so many quiet moments of companionship. "Do you ever miss the excitement of those early years?" Sarah asked one evening in the spring of 1912. "When everything was uncertain and we were fighting to survive?" James was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I miss the feeling of being young and having our whole lives ahead of us," he admitted. "But I do not miss the fear, the constant worry that we might lose everything, and I would not trade what we have now, this big, noisy, complicated, wonderful family, for anything in the world." Sarah smiled and squeezed his hand. "Neither would I. Though sometimes I look at our grandchildren and I cannot believe that we built all of this, that 2 people who started with nothing but determination and a diverted stream could create such a legacy." "It was never just about the water," James said thoughtfully. "The water was important. It saved the cattle and gave us a fighting chance. But what really saved this ranch was us, working together, refusing to give up on each other or on our dreams. The water flowed through the land, but love was what made everything grow." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at his words. Even after nearly 30 years of marriage, James could still move her with his quiet wisdom and his deep understanding of what truly mattered. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together in companionable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple, and the first stars began to appear. Their grandson, Samuel's eldest boy, came running around the corner of the house, pursued by his younger sister. They were laughing and shrieking, their faces flushed with the exertion of play. When they saw their grandparents, they skidded to a halt. "Grandpa James, will you tell us the story again?" the boy asked breathlessly. "About how you saved Grandma Sarah's ranch from the bad man?" James exchanged a look with Sarah, and she nodded, smiling. It was their favorite story, the one their grandchildren never tired of hearing. "Well," James said, settling back in his chair and pulling his grandson onto his lap, while his granddaughter climbed into Sarah's arms. "It all started on a hot summer day in 1883, when I was a young cowboy looking for work, and I rode up to a ranch that was dying from drought. And standing on this very porch was the most beautiful, determined woman I had ever seen, and I knew right then and there that my wandering days were over." Sarah listened to her husband tell the story, embellishing it slightly for dramatic effect, and she watched their grandchildren's rapt faces as they hung on every word. She thought about how that hot summer day had changed everything, how one moment of bravery and compassion had set in motion a chain of events that had led to this perfect evening, surrounded by family and love. The ranch house lights began to glow warm yellow in the gathering dusk. Inside, she could hear the sounds of the family preparing for supper, multiple generations all coming together for the evening meal. It was loud and chaotic and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also the fulfillment of everything she and James had dreamed of during those hard early years. By 1915, the Whitaker-Brennan Ranch encompassed over 10,000 acres and ran nearly 1,000 head of cattle. It employed a dozen full-time hands and was considered one of the most progressive and well-managed operations in Texas. But more important than its size or success was the fact that it remained a family ranch, managed by and for the descendants of Sarah Whitaker and James Brennan. That year, James became ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Sarah nursed him through it, sitting by his bedside for weeks, refusing to leave him even when the doctor suggested she get some rest. Her devotion paid off, and James recovered, though the illness left him weakened. "I am not ready to go yet," he told Sarah one night after he had finally turned the corner toward recovery. "I have too much left to do, too many sunsets left to watch with you." "Good," Sarah said, gripping his hand tightly, "because I am not ready to let you go. We made a deal, remember? Together through everything, until the very end." "Together through everything," James agreed, his voice still weak but his eyes full of love. He did recover, though he was never quite as strong as he had been before the illness. But he adapted, taking on less physically demanding work and spending more time training the younger generation in the business side of ranching. Sarah, too, began to slow down, her joints aching on cold mornings, her energy not what it once was. But they were together, and that was all that mattered. The years of the First World War came and went, touching their lives only lightly. Young Thomas's eldest son enlisted and served in France, returning home in 1919 with medals and stories, and a deep appreciation for the peaceful life of the ranch. The war years had been good for cattle prices, and the ranch prospered even as the world descended into chaos. In 1920, Sarah and James celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together over 100 people, family and friends and neighbors and ranch hands, all of them there to honor the couple who had become legends in their own time. Speeches were made and toasts were given, and through it all, James and Sarah sat together, holding hands, overwhelmed by the love and respect that surrounded them. 35 years, Sarah said wonderingly as they prepared for bed that night, exhausted but happy. "It feels like yesterday, and like a lifetime ago all at once." "Best 35 years of my life," James said, pulling her close. "Every single day with you has been a gift, Sarah. Even the hard ones, even the scary ones. I would not change any of it." "Neither would I," Sarah agreed, resting her head on his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "You kept your promise, James. You saved my everything. The ranch, my family, my life, my heart. Everything that matters." They were in their 60s now, their children grown with children and even grandchildren of their own. The ranch was secure, its future assured by the next generation. They had accomplished everything they had set out to do, and more. And they had done it together, just as they had promised on that December evening in 1884 when James had asked Sarah to be his wife. The 1920s brought new challenges and changes. The automobile became common, and trucks began to replace horses and wagons for many tasks. The ranch installed telephones and electricity in all the buildings. The children began talking about radios and moving pictures and other modern marvels that sometimes made James and Sarah feel like relics of a bygone era. But the land remained constant, and the work of ranching stayed fundamentally the same. Cattle still needed to be tended, fences still needed to be mended, water still needed to be managed. And every evening, James and Sarah still sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the creek that had brought them together. In the summer of 1925, on a warm July evening, James and Sarah sat together on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. The air was sweet with the scent of the roses Sarah had planted years ago, and the sound of the creek running full and strong through the property was a constant soothing background music. "I have been thinking," James said quietly, "about what we should tell the young ones, about what really matters. They see the ranch, the success, the land, and the cattle, but I want them to understand what really built all of this." "Love," Sarah said simply. "Love and partnership, and never giving up on each other." "Exactly," James agreed. "I want them to know that the water I diverted that night was just the beginning, that what really saved this ranch was two people choosing each other every single day, through good times and bad. That is the real legacy we are leaving them." Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "They will know," she promised, "because they will see how we live, how we love each other, how we face everything together. Actions speak louder than words, and our life together has been one long declaration of love." James pulled her close, and they sat together as the stars came out, as the night sounds of the ranch filled the air, as the creek murmured its endless song. They had built something beautiful and lasting, not just a ranch but a family, not just a business, but a legacy of love. The years continued to pass, each one a blessing. James and Sarah grew old together, their bodies slowing, but their spirits never dimming. They were surrounded by love, by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. The ranch continued to thrive, adapted to changing times while holding fast to the values that had made it great. On a warm spring morning in 1933, James Brennan passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Sarah holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed. He was 77 years old, and he had lived a full, rich life filled with love and purpose. His last words were to Sarah, a whispered, "Together forever, my love," that broke her heart and filled it with gratitude all at once. Sarah mourned deeply, but not despairingly. She had had 50 years with the love of her life, and she knew that every moment had been precious. She continued to live on the ranch, still active and involved despite her 74 years. She told stories about James to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive and ensuring that future generations would know the kind of man he had been. She lived for another 5 years, years filled with family and love and the satisfaction of seeing her legacy secured. The ranch continued to prosper under the management of her children and grandchildren, all of them working together just as she and James had always done. Sarah Brennan passed away in her sleep on a summer night in 1938, exactly 55 years after James had first ridden onto her property looking for work. She was 79 years old, and she had lived a life beyond her wildest dreams. When her children went through her things, they found a journal she had kept over the years, filled with thoughts and memories and reflections on her life with James. The last entry, written just days before her death, read, "I have lived a blessed life. When I was 23 and facing the loss of everything I held dear, I could never have imagined the happiness that was coming. James was my miracle, my salvation, my everything. He diverted a stream and saved my ranch, but he did so much more than that. He taught me what real partnership means, what true love looks like, what it means to build something lasting. Our love was the foundation of everything we created. And I know that legacy will live on long after I am gone. The ranch will endure, our family will thrive, and somewhere in the stars I will find James again, and we will watch over it all together." Sarah and James were buried side by side in the family cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the creek that had brought them together. Their graves became a place of pilgrimage for their descendants, a reminder of where the family had come from and the love that had made everything possible. The Whitaker Brennan Ranch continued to operate for generations, growing and adapting with the times, but never losing sight of the values that had founded it. The story of Sarah and James became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires, a story of love and courage and determination that inspired each new generation. The creek still runs through the property, its water sustaining the land and the cattle just as it did over a century ago. And on summer evenings, when the sun sets over the Texas prairie and the air is filled with the scent of sage and the sounds of the cattle, some say you can still sense the presence of Sarah and James, forever watching over the land they loved, forever together in the legacy they built. Their love story, born out of desperation and drought, became a testament to the power of hope and partnership. James had diverted a stream and saved Sarah's ranch, but together they had created something far greater than either of them alone could have imagined. They had built a family, a business, a legacy that would endure through wars and depressions, through droughts and floods, through all the challenges that time and fate could throw at it. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth, that two people who choose each other, who work together, who refuse to give up on each other or their dreams, can overcome anything. The water that flows through the Whitaker Brennan Ranch is not just water. It is a symbol of life and love and the unbreakable bond between two souls who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a love that would truly last forever.